Hey everybody, it's CJ Graham, Jason, Friday the 13th, Part 6, Hell Coppin', Highway to Hell. I just want to make sure you guys know you're listening to the 80s slasher Librarian.
Friday the 13th, Part 2, the novelization by Simon Hawke. Chapter 11. Jenny had to get out of this somehow. She had to. She couldn't let it all end here. Suddenly, he came crashing through the underbrush at the side of the trail, lunging at her. She barely twisted away from him with a terrified cry and continued running up the path. She plunged through the door of her cabin, not really knowing where she was going, but merely fleeing from his relentless pursuit as she heard his heavy footsteps coming up the path. She scrambled underneath her bed, curling herself up into a tiny ball and holding her breath as the door swung open with a squeak and he came into the cabin. When she saw his heavy black mud-encrusted boots approach the bed and pause, she bit her lower lip, afraid to make the slightest sound. The floorboard creaked as he moved closer, seeking her. She saw him go over to the storage closet and fling the door open, looking for her. Then he flung a chair away from him with frustration. Suddenly she sensed another presence under her bed with her, and bit her tongue to keep from screaming as a huge rat scuttled past her face. She cringed as the rodent stopped within inches of her, its whiskers twitching, its feral mouth working, its nose sniffing at her. In utter horror and revulsion, Jenny drew her knees up beneath her and choked back a moan as her bladder released a hot stream of urine. Jason paused on his way back out the door, noticing the trickle of liquid coming from underneath the bed. Jenny peered out from her hiding place. There was no sign of Jason's heavy boots. Could he have left? Slowly, tentatively, she ventured out, looking all around her. She heard a creak and glanced up to see Jason standing above her on a chair, his pitchfork poised to strike. Her eyes went wide and she screamed, recoiling instinctively, saved only by the flimsy wooden chair breaking under Jason's weight at the last moment. It collapsed beneath him, sending him crashing to the floor. The pitchfork splintered and broke in half as he fell. Suddenly, remembering what she had hidden in the storage closet of her cabin, Jenny threw the door open and reached for the chainsaw that she had left there earlier. She flicked on the switch and gave the starter cord a furious yank, almost crying when the chainsaw started on the first pull. She brought it around just barely in time as Jason lunged at her. The whirring blades missed his hooded face by inches, and he recoiled, retreating before the swiftly whirring teeth as Jenny came at him, brandishing her weapon. He threw up his arm to protect himself, and the saw bit into it, chewing through the flesh and biting into bone where it got stuck and caused the motor to stall as Jason stuck out with his other arm to knock the saw away. He doubled over and covered himself up. Jenny picked up a wooden chair and brought it down upon him with all of her might. Jason fell and lay still as it broke over his head. She turned and ran, only wanting to put as much distance between herself and the psychopathic killer as possible. She had never been so scared in her entire life. My God, she thought, it's all true. The legend had been real all along. He must have been living out there in the woods all these years like the story claimed, and when Paul came back here to open up his training center, that was what had set him off. Paul. She clutched at her stomach as she staggered down the trail toward the woods. Oh God, she thought, Paul, he's dead. They must all be dead. I must be the only one that made it out alive. And then she suddenly remembered. Ted! If he had clicked with Maggie and gone to spend the night with her, then he would probably be all right. But if he came to the training center late, there was a good chance that he would run right into Jason. He might be coming back even at this very moment. Her car was dead. There was no way to go except on foot. She decided to cut through the woods and head for the country road leading into town. If Ted was coming back, she'd recognize Jeff's pickup and try to head him off. Otherwise, she'd go straight to the police and tell them what had happened. She stumbled down the forest trail, gasping for breath, trying to will her pounding heart to slow down. She reached a small stream and sat down on the bank for a moment, trying to catch her breath. Her head was swimming. She was having trouble thinking clearly, which was not unusual under the circumstances. She was in a daze, half in shock from her terrifying experience. "Think," she told herself, digging her fingernails into her palms, trying to use the pain to snap herself out of her shock. "Get yourself together. Figure out where you are." As near as she could remember, the country road leading to town was in a northerly direction, which meant she had to cross the stream and keep going straight until she hit it. She splashed across the stream and pushed through a break in the thicket. On the other side, she came through into a small clearing with the dark silhouette of a wooden cabin about 50 feet on the other side. She could see a candle burning in the window. Without realizing where she was, she ran toward the cabin, thinking that whoever was inside could help her. "Help me!" she cried. "Please, help me!" She burst into the cabin. The place was incredibly filthy, and the smell that assaulted her was horrifying. It was a smell unlike anything she'd ever encountered before. She gagged, holding her mouth against the unbelievable stench. Who could possibly live in such a place? The roof was falling in. The glass in the windows was cracked and broken. The pantry doors had all fallen off their hinges. Garbage was strewn all over the place, and the smell of feces was overpowering. The moist, pungent odor of rot permeated the room, and yet there was another smell even more horrendous. A sickly, sour, sweet smell that was enough to bring tears to her eyes. The odor of decomposition and decay. With the sinking feeling, she suddenly realized where she was. She was standing in the ruins of one of the old cabins of Crystal Lake. She had found Camp Blood. This had to be the place where Jason had taken refuge, the place where he'd been hiding all these years. Her worst suspicions were confirmed when she glanced out through the broken window and saw the hooded figure of Jason Voorhees come running down the trail, following her like a relentless juggernaut. She cried out and slammed the door shut, bolting it. There was no escape. She ran for the back room as she heard the weight of his body slam against the front door, making it shudder on its ancient hinges. She knew it would not keep him out for long. She burst into the back room and slammed the door shut behind her, jamming the bolt in place, and then she suddenly became aware of a flickering light behind her and the overpowering smell. She turned around. Her jaw dropped and her eyes went wide with horror. She shoved her fist into her mouth to shut off the screams that started to spill out of her, and she bit down on her knuckles hard enough to draw blood. In the center of the room was a crudely constructed wooden altar made from a table covered with a filthy canvas drop cloth. Insects scurried across the canvas, crawling over the surface of the table. Surrounded by flickering candles like votive offerings in a church was the rotting, worm-eaten, decapitated head of Pamela Voorhees. And laid out on the table in front of the grisly head was a filthy, moth-eaten sweater, a dirty old pair of dark woolen trousers, and an 8-inch hunting knife in a soiled leather sheath, and a blood-caked machete. Piled on the floor all around the altar were the blood-soaked bodies of the slain counselors, as well as the corpse of Deputy Sheriff Winslow, and the long decayed remains of Alice, who had been the lone survivor of the massacre at Camp Crystal Lake. Jason had taken his vengeance upon them all. He had brought them home to Mother. Jenny heard the outside door splinter and give way. Then she heard the heavy tread of boots outside the door to the back room. There was nowhere left to run. She looked all around herself desperately, but it was hopeless. There was no escape. Clenching her fist and hyperventilating, trying to keep from completely succumbing to hysterics, Jenny tried to force herself to ignore the horror that confronted her, to think of some way out of this terrifying predicament. She could not accept that her death was inevitable. She could not give up. There had to be something she could do. The door to the back room shuddered as something hard struck it with a powerful blow, and Jenny recoiled as the tip of a pickaxe came crashing through the wood. "Oh no, no, no," she whimpered as the axe head was worked back and forth, freed from the wood and drawn back to smash into the door again. She sank down to her knees, fighting back the tears, struggling to keep the screams bottled up because she knew that the moment she gave way to panic, it would all be over. Chapter 12. The pickaxe crashed into the door again, splintering it still further. In a moment he'd be through, and he would tear her to pieces for profaning the shrine he had consecrated with blood to his mother. She glanced at the hideous, decomposing head of Pamela Voorhees, and a desperate idea came to her. As Jason pounded at the door with a pickaxe, breaking his way through, Jenny reached out to the altar and picked up the stinking, filthy sweater. Overcoming her revulsion, she quickly pulled it on over her head, trying not to think about the insects crawling over the table where it had lain. Then she crouched down, kneeling in front of the rotting head of Jason's mother, trying not to gag on the stench of decomposing flesh as she tucked her hair down underneath the sweater, arranging it in a rough approximation of the tattered wisp of hair upon the grisly head. She almost fainted when a huge blood-engorged worm slithered out of the head's open mouth, but she managed to fight down the panic as she smeared dirt upon her features and prayed the ruse would work. It was a wild gamble, a desperate last-ditch attempt to survive, but she had no other options. She would assume the role of Jason's mother and pray that with her college psychology, she could manipulate him into buying it. It was her only chance. She reached for the machete lying on the table. The door burst in as Jason broke through, shouldering the debris aside and holding the pickaxe aloft, ready to strike. He saw her and hesitated for a moment, a look of confusion in his eyes. "Jason?" Jenny said quickly, leaning toward him slightly. "It's done, Jason. You've done your job well, and Mommy is pleased." He started to lower the pickaxe. "That's a good boy," Jenny said soothingly. "Come to Mommy." She held the machete out of sight behind her back. She tried to keep her voice from trembling as she spoke. "Come on," she said, as he took one shuffling step toward her, cocking his head uncertainly. "Come on, Mommy has a reward for you." He stopped, looking doubtful, and started to lift the axe once more. Jenny swallowed hard, trying to keep her nerves steady. "Jason, Mother is talking to you," she said, raising her voice as if she were chiding a misbehaving boy. He paused hesitantly, lowering the axe again. "Come on," she said. "That's my boy. Kneel down. Mother has something for you." He started to go down to his knees. "That's it. Kneel down," she said, watching him intently as he knelt before her, the axe held loosely before him. "That's right," she said, slowly lifting the machete with both hands. "Kneel down." But as she twisted slightly, raising the machete, Jason caught a glimpse of his mother's head behind her, and his eyes blazed up at her with fury as she brought the machete down in a fast swing. But it was not fast enough. He parried it with the axe head, and the shock of the impact caused her to let go. The machete clattered to the floor. He swung the pickaxe, and Jenny cried out with agony as the blade caught her in the leg, making a deep gash. "Jenny!" Paul shouted, bursting into the room, bruised and bleeding. He threw himself at Jason, and the two of them staggered around the room, their arms locked around each other, knocking into the walls as each tried to break the other's grip. They slammed hard into the wreckage of the door, and the impact transmitted up the wall, caused several rotting ceiling beams to give way and fall down on top of them. Jenny scrambled for the machete as Jason forced Paul down onto the floor, pinning him with his knees. He retrieved the pickaxe and raised it high over his head so he could murder Paul. But at that precise moment, Jenny lunged at him, bringing the machete down with all of her might. She swung it like a butcher's maul, putting everything she had into the stroke. The blade whistled through the air and buried itself deep in Jason's shoulder, chopping through the trapezius muscle and the collarbone, almost separating his entire left arm and shoulder from his body. He did not utter a sound. He stiffened and then fell over to his side, sprawling on the floor with the machete embedded deeply in his upper body. He lay utterly still. Jenny stood transfixed, staring down at him. Paul got up beside her. For the first time, he took in the terrifying significance of the back room, the altar with its candles, the rotting severed head of Mrs. Voorhees, the bodies of the slain counselors. He shook his head slowly, horrified at what he saw, not wanting to believe it. Jenny slowly bent down, reaching for the hood over Jason's head. She bit her lower lip and grabbed the hood, then slowly pulled it off, revealing Jason's face. They both stared with horror and revulsion at the grotesque features of the monster who had stalked Camp Blood, a boy who had drowned and somehow came back from the dead to take revenge on all those who had wronged him and his mother. "Jesus," Paul said in a shocked whisper. Jenny grabbed his arm convulsively and shuddered. He took her by the shoulders and turned her away from the horrid sight. "Let's go, Jenny," he said, supporting her with his arm across his shoulders. Paul helped her out of the cabin and back down the trail to the training center. She winced from the pain in her gashed leg as the sensation finally penetrated after the shock. She managed to stumble down to the stream with his help, but then she finally collapsed, unable to continue. The pain was just too much to take. She was biting her lip to keep from crying out. Paul could tell she was in agony. He knelt down beside her to examine the wound. It did look pretty bad. They would have to do something about it soon, before it became infected. "Come on, I'll carry you," he said, picking her up in his arms. He managed to get her back to her cabin, where he lowered her gently to the bed. He was exhausted, and she was near the end of her rope. Her eyes were squeezed tightly shut as she winced from the pain when he put her on the bed. He touched her face and she threw her arms around him, sobbing as the full impact of her experience finally registered. Hey, you're all right," he said, holding her and kissing her, trying to calm her down. "It's over. You're okay, Jenny, you're all right." He hugged her close, stroking her hair to reassure her. Suddenly there was a noise outside. He felt Jenny stiffen in his arms as she stared, terror-stricken, at the door. Paul glanced at the door, then looked at Jenny sitting there, frozen with fear. She had gone almost completely white. He looked around for something to use as a weapon, and his gaze fell on the splintered pitchfork Jason had left behind. Paul picked it up and gave the part with the sharp tines to Jenny, taking the shorter part with the iron handle for himself. He held it in his left hand as a club, hefting it experimentally. It would just have to do. Jenny took the busted pitchfork and braced it against the bed, holding it out before her like a spear. Paul glanced at her and she nodded. Whatever happened now, they were as ready for it as they could be, and at least they were together. He tiptoed over to the door and stood beside it, listening intently. He seemed to hear a soft scratching sound. He swallowed hard, reached out for the doorknob, took hold of it, and raised the pitchfork handle high over his head. He twisted the knob and flung the door open, and Terry's little dog Muffin, mud-spattered and completely soaked, trotted into the room. The ribbon in her fur was like wet noodles, and she was filthy from being out in the storm. She jumped up into Paul's arms, her tongue lolling and her tail wagging happily. "Muffin!" "Oh," Paul said, picking her up. Jenny put down the pitchfork as relief flooded through her. "Muffin! Oh, Muffin, you're okay," she said. She reached out for the little dog, and suddenly the window behind her shattered into 1,000 knife-edged fragments as Jason came crashing through it. Jenny had a brief glimpse of the stunned, disbelieving expression on Paul's face, and then she felt Jason's powerful arms encircle her. She saw his horribly ugly face, tufts of wispy hair matted against his mostly bald and puckered scalp, jutting, discolored, rotting teeth, his hideously deformed features, and the awful smell of him like a corpse rising from the grave. And then her vision blurred, and everything went black as she fainted from stark terror. She regained consciousness tied down to a stretcher gurney as two attendants wheeled her towards an ambulance. It was daytime. She looked around, dazed, astonished to discover that she was still alive. There were flashing lights all around her, and she could hear the crackle of a police radio. And then she remembered with shocking clarity what had happened before she had passed out, and so she cried out, "Paul! Where's Paul? Paul!" No one answered her. She struggled against the restraining straps as they loaded her into the ambulance without saying a word. She kept crying out for Paul as they shut the doors behind her, and the ambulance finally pulled away, heading off down the dirt road back toward town and the county hospital. The sheriff stood by his police cruiser parked outside the cabin, his hands thrust into the pockets of his black leather jacket and his hat pulled low over his eyes as he watched the ambulance drive off. They had found the others, but so far they had not found Holt. There was no sign of him except some blood upon the floor in there. He sighed heavily. Now the shit would really hit the fan, he thought. He'd have to call the poor parents of those murdered kids. The press would descend upon the town like vultures, and they'd resurrect the story of Camp Blood. Everyone would want to know how the maniac had been able to live out there on the grounds of the old camp without anyone spotting him, and why he hadn't been arrested. It would all have to fall on someone, and as sheriff, he would be elected. Everyone would wind up screaming for his hide. He walked around to the back of the cabin and looked down at the large footprints in the mud. Bastard, he thought. He looked up and gazed up into the woods, thinking that you could put together the biggest dragnet in 3 counties and comb these woods for months and never find him. He exhaled heavily. Damn, he thought. Another week and I'd have been packed and heading for Wyoming. Now, I could kiss that Wyoming job goodbye. Look like I'm stuck in Crystal Lake. He shook his head with resignation. Well, at least it was a friendly little town. Too bad there was no way out. Okay, Slashaholics, the end. This has been Friday the 13th, Part 2, the novelization by Simon Hawke. I gotta say, I enjoyed this book more than I enjoyed Friday the 13th, Part 1, the novelization, because in that book, Simon Hawke had way too much filler, because he had to go by the rules of the first movie, which was keep the killer a secret, even though anybody that read that book, at least 99% of them knew that Pamela was the killer. Ooh, hope I didn't spoil that for anybody that's listening to Part 2 before Part 1. Oh no. But yeah, so Friday the 13th, Part 2, let's talk about it. We had some interesting backstories with Jason. We got into Jason's head quite a bit. We got a pretty good explanation about the whole did he drown, didn't he drown, is he alive, is he dead? And it looks like he did in fact die and drown as a kid, but somehow came back out and regenerated slowly and still aged. So I enjoy the fact that, according to Simon Hawke at least, Jason has always been Zombie Jason in all the movies that he's appeared in. So, yay for Team Zombie Jason, I guess. The character development was pretty good in this book, other than a chapter where it took way too much backstory for like the deputy guy that got killed at Jason's shack. That went on a little too long, but for the most part, any backstory and inner monologues we got from the characters was not too bad. In fact, it made the characters even more interesting, more likable. Because I mean, I like all the characters in this particular book, movie, Friday the 13th Part 2 has some very likable characters all around. Whereas a bunch of the other movies, you get characters that you despise, you don't care for. Kind of like Part 3, I don't really care about hardly any of the characters in Part 3 at all. Part 4, there's a couple that are, obviously Tommy Jarvis and Crispin Glover's character for the most part. Type that into your computer. Simon Hawke does a very good job of really putting you in the action. The tense scenes that keep you on the edge of your seat, the way he writes suspense and the kills he writes are very creative, very, how do I put this? The imagery he portrays, it makes it where you don't even have to use a bunch of your imagination, because he's very vivid with it. All you got to do is picture what he's writing, and you're right there in the middle of it like you're watching the movie yourself. The thing I love about novelizations is a novelization that sticks to the movie for the most part, but also isn't afraid to take liberties of its own, expand the story, and I think this one did it a little bit. Not as much as some of the other books, but it did it enough that I really enjoyed this book more than the first one, and I'm looking forward to Friday the 13th Part 3 by Simon Hawke. I know we've already done the Michael Avallone version on the channel, and that one was very different since it was based on an earlier script of the movie. But listen to those cars in the background. This is what I deal with whenever I'm narrating for you guys, by the way. Got to stop, start, stop, start. But yeah, his version of Part 3, Simon Hawke's version, is more true to the movie, from what I've heard. And Michael Avallone's version was more true to the original script for Part 3. So I'm looking forward to that. I enjoyed Jason in this book, not only his backstory that we got, or his inner monologues, what was going through his head, the voices and all that, but I also enjoyed the way he was written, the way he was kind of stalkery and, putting, plans together, and the way he looked. I don't know, something about having that hood on his head with 2 eye holes cut out is even creepier than just the one, because he was able to, stare down these people. It kept saying that, they could look into both his eyes and they could see the evil there, the hatred there. So all in all, I enjoyed this one more than Part 1. I can't say anything about Part 3 yet. We'll be doing that one pretty soon on the channel. I hope you all enjoyed this book. Thank God Muffin's okay, right? But now I want to talk about my dislikes. The biggest one, we still got no explanation on what happened to Ted. He's the luckiest son of a gun out of the whole group. Went out to the bar, decided to go home with Maggie. And so we never heard from him again. I always assumed the movie had to wrap up filming. They ran out of money or something, so it got rushed in the end. And that's why we never got an explanation on Ted. And we never got an explanation on Paul. So I was really hoping that Simon Hawke would dive into that with the book. But no, all we got was a mention from Jenny thinking if Ted doesn't come back, then he's going to be okay. And Paul, no more explanation than we got in the movie, other than the sheriff, something about him finding blood in the cabin room that supposedly belonged to Paul. I guess he's guessing that. But no, they never found his body. No extra explanation. I really thought that scene had been rushed in the movie, and when I did the novelization, because this was my first time reading this, I was really expecting an explanation after, Jenny was pulled out the window. I thought we would get a scene of her, Paul, and Jason fighting it out, and us filling in that gap between her being pulled through the window and her waking up being put in the ambulance. So, I got to take some points off right there for that, because that was a big disappointment. And not finding out what happened to Ted was another disappointment. A subscriber did point out that they think Ted is the one that called the cops. He came home, found all the dead bodies, the hurt people. Maybe not all the dead bodies since they were out at the Jason's shack or whatever. But found Jenny or something, maybe found Paul, and he's the one that called the police or went and got the police. So that's an interesting theory. But yeah, that's what I think of Friday the 13th Part 2. But I want to know what you guys thought of this book by Simon Hawke. So please sound off in the comments section below. Hope you really enjoyed this book as much as I did, and I hope you're looking forward to even more Friday the 13th narrations in the future. Even though we're going to run out of books pretty soon, official ones, I'm going to do some comics. I'm going to do some fan fiction. There's always going to be a place for Jason here on the channel, one way or the other. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. This has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thank you for subscribing. If this is your first time here on the channel and this is your first audiobook by me that you've heard, please hit the playlist section up. I've done over 50 out-of-print slasher novels, Jason, Freddy, Michael, Chucky, even Final Destination, Demon Knight, Gremlins. It's anything you can think of. If it's an out-of-print horror book or movie novelization, it's going to be here on the channel eventually, if it's not here already. Love you all. Be excellent to each other. And I'll see you next time. The library is always open. And also, please check out the Patreon link. This channel is not monetized on YouTube and cannot be, and it's very expensive to keep it going. These books are not cheap, and I depend on awesome listeners like yourself to sign up on Patreon, help support the channel, and keep it going and growing for years to come. You also get some great rewards like free merch, free ebooks. You can voice a character depending on the tier you select. You get an exclusive podcast every week and early access to certain narrations. So much stuff on there. Memberships start as low as $2. Tonight's upload is brought to you by our patrons on the Patreon page. That's Tyrone Kennard, Nick Velcarve, Jeffrey Quick, Daniel Mackey, David Arnold, Alex Vanover, Krista Campbell, Rob Davey, Jay Gardner, Willow Ravenwood, Lauren Vaught, Kristen Kay, Michael, William Schaefer, Liam Anderson, Bree, Bonanza Jellybean, Ryan Woodward, Allison Seib, Iron Alexa, Hawaii, Cecilia Spears, Sean Campbell, Catherine McClear, Tony DeVore, Seminole, and Carl Eakins. And thank you so much for supporting the channel. And don't click that thumbs down button, because
it's got a death curse!
There's a lover